Brown back. And one of his traditions is to welcome new members. So if there are any new members here tonight, please raise your hand, or people who have never been to the club before. We have a couple. Thank you for showing up. And I'd like to introduce Dr. John Rose. He is the William Keenan Professor of History at Drew University. He's the author of The Intellectual Life of the British Working Class. That was a book of the year. Right? Book of the Year.
The Economist magazine.
Yes. He was editor of Book History, put out by Johns Hopkins University Press. He has two daughters, one of who is also going to be an author. And without further ado, I hand the microphone over.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I sort of actually, when I'm a professor, I usually don't speak with amplification. So. And I walk around and do all sorts of dramatics. So maybe I'll do it this way, at least at first. I want to talk about Winston Churchill and the literary side of the Second World War. Because, of course, Churchill, amongst the great world leaders, was the most famous and accomplished author. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature, specifically for his account, his massive 6-volume history of the Second World War. It's been said they wanted to offer him the Nobel Peace Prize, but that would be sort of difficult. It's like he fought a war, and all that. So they gave him the prize for literature. And I think, by the way, he deserved it. If he had never entered politics, he could have made a very nice living and become quite famous purely as an author. He was a bestseller, many of his books. He wrote biography, he wrote histories, he wrote political commentary, he wrote about popular science. Okay? He was fascinated by science fiction, and he wrote about it, didn't actually write it. But above all, he wrote about war. That was his favorite subject. Literature and war in his mind were one and the same topic. If you ask why, well, perhaps it has to do to some extent with his ancestry. Now, most of us know that Churchill's ancestor on his father's side was the Duke of Marlborough, one of the founding fathers of the British Empire, and that Churchill very much modeled himself after him. That's certainly true. What is often overlooked, however, is that on his mother's side, he had another role model, and that was his maternal grandfather, Leonard Jerome, an American. Leonard Jerome was the proprietor of the New York Times during the Civil War. And, it was a very pro-Lincoln newspaper, and you perhaps heard of the big draft riots in New York in 1863. Well, the Times was one of the targets of the rioters. And the Army gave Leonard Jerome Gatling guns to hold off the rioters. As you can see, and this is a story that made a big impression on young Winston, as you can sort of see how he would associate war and journalism in his mind. He wanted to publicize himself. He realized that he could build a political career by first making a big splash as a journalist, which he did successfully. And also he was perhaps on a spiritual quest. Churchill was not religious. He did not believe in personal immortality. He thought you went out like a light when you died. But he said the one way that you can become immortal is through writing. Words live forever, he said. So this was, if you write books, write classic books, then you achieve a kind of immortality, and that's what I think what he really aimed to do. Now, he did have a very domineering father who was constantly, tearing him down. One of those parents you could never possibly do anything to please, you know how it is. And one of the things his father ragged him about endlessly was his writing. The letters he wrote home from school, his father would just tear them apart. They're ungrammatical. They're flaccid writing. You don't know how to write. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, had tried writing some journalistic articles of his own. He wasn't very successful at it. Then his father dies, holding Dr. Freud, and Winston becomes a war correspondent and is a much bigger success than his father. He proves he can do it. His first assignment is in Cuba. So a few years before the U.S. gets involved in the Spanish-American War, there's an insurrection going on in Cuba, Spain trying to put it down. Winston goes to cover it. Nothing much happens when he's there. When he is interviewed afterwards by reporters in New York, he tells them, it's been said, in a war, it takes 2,000 bullets to kill a man. I think in the Cuban War, it takes 2,000 bullets to miss a man. Winston, or you're learning the power of the sound bite. That's how you get quoted in the media. And he was. But he goes on to write books about colonial wars in India, in the Sudan, in South Africa, and his celebrity grows and grows and grows, and his income grows and grows and grows, and he does use that platform to launch a springboard into parliamentary politics. Okay. During the Second World War, when it begins, he's First Lord of the Admiralty. He's sending memoranda all over the government. And a civil servant said, I see Winston's collecting material for his next book. Well, he was, in fact. In both the First World War and the Second World War, Churchill made a policy that none of his orders were to be obeyed unless they were in writing. No oral orders. Okay. Now, there's a very sensible reason for doing that, because if you allow oral orders to be obeyed, you might say something off the top of your head, which is not meant seriously, and somebody actually goes out and does it, which you don't want. But the other reason is he's generating a paper trail. He is, in a sense, composing the book, which later became the history of the Second World War. And he also wrote, by the way, a history of the First World War, called The World Crisis. And how did he write them? Very simply. He just collected all the government, all the memoranda he'd all written, and there it is. And these memoranda are not dry bureaucratic documents. They contain all those wonderful Churchillian literary flourishes. Stylistically, they're brilliant. Why did he bother? Because he knew that was going to appear in print later on. Yeah. He's always on stage, if you want to put it that way. What were the sources of his literary style? Well, among other things, I did some research in the Churchill archives at Cambridge. And I discovered in one file hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of receipts for theater ticket booking agencies. You have an account with them, they'll get you tickets, they still have them for Broadway shows. And that's how you order tickets. Well, he must have gone to the theater every other night. He loved it. Unfortunately, the receipts don't indicate which plays he saw, but there are other documents, like his letters, which allow us to reconstruct that in part. And it's clear he loved playwrights like Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, Noel Coward, and I think he loved the theater because he himself was a performer. Always on stage, always performing in front of an audience. And though he never wrote a play, I think he could have been a terrific playwright because he knew how to construct a drama. Now, in addition to the playwrights you've all heard of, I just mentioned that he modeled himself after, he also was very interested in a dramatic genre that's dead today, so you probably aren't familiar with it. But it was very, very popular when he was a young man, and that is Victorian melodrama. If you saw these plays today, you'd laugh at them. They would be mawkish, they'd be sentimental, very simplistic, full of stereotypes. But they're very popular at the time, and he loved them. Now, and you have to understand what Victorian melodrama was all about if you want to understand Churchill's mindset. And the first principle is there are no moral ambiguities in melodrama. You have a hero who is purely good versus a villain who is absolutely evil. Okay. There's a struggle that goes on. The villain, in aside to the audience, will tell you exactly what his nefarious plans are. The hero doesn't notice what the villain's up to. The hero's pretty stupid, actually. But he can't notice it, because if he noticed it, he would take countermeasures, and then there'd be no play. So you have to allow the villain to unwind his evil scheme. And there's always a point where the villain has the hero with his back to the wall. And it looks like the hero, he's never going to possibly get his way out of this. And the villain calls upon the hero to surrender, give up. There's no way you can get out of this. And then in every melodrama, the hero steps forward, the action stops, and he delivers a long speech shaking his fist in the villain's face, saying, "No, I will never surrender." Okay? You need to see where all this is leading? This is what I am fighting for. These are the principles. Do whatever you like. I am never giving in. Now, there's a word for this kind of device, stage device. It's called claptrap. Okay. Now, today the word claptrap means any kind of nonsense, hooey, whatever, But back then it meant a specific stage device, and that is this kind of a speech. And why is it called that? Because as soon as the hero finishes a speech, the audience all claps. You're trapped into clapping. You have to clap. Okay. But this was something that very much struck Churchill as a young man. And I think he always, in any battle, in any political struggle he fought, he always saw things in black and white terms. Good versus evil. And most of the time, he was wrong, or at least he was just too simplistic. Because we all know that most of politics is not like that. Okay? But in 1939, he was right, facing down Hitler. And that's what I think equipped him to engage in the kind of rhetoric that would really inspire the British people. Now, melodrama, as I say, was very popular in the Victorian period. It was very flamboyant, very full of high oratory and so on. It went out of fashion after the First World War. It was then after that viewed as mawkish, sentimental, Victorian, because what had the experience of the war been, of the First World War been for the British people? They had gone into it with lots of patriotic rhetoric, lots of flags flying, painting the Kaiser as absolutely evil. And after 4 years of this, there was widespread disillusionment. War wasn't like as was depicted on the Victorian stage. It was a long, grinding, morally ambiguous struggle that was more tragic and absurd than heroic. And it led to a general feeling that we can't trust this rhetoric, this old-fashioned rhetoric. We can't trust, all these old Victorian ideals are claptrap, if you will. And we have to look at things more realistically. There's a very good book by Paul Fussell, who was a professor at Rutgers University, The Great War and Modern Memory. You may know it. And what he argued is that the First World War shaped our whole modern consciousness. In other words, because of that war experience, we no longer view things in black and white terms. We no longer view war as a great adventure. We view it as a horror. We view it as futile. We view it as absurd. Okay. And of course, he was writing just after the Vietnam War, so you can see why his book had resonated so much with the American public. And this indeed was the mood that set in England after the First World War. Churchill writes a history of the First World War. As I said, it's called the World Crisis. It is reasonably successful in Britain, but in America, it's a very different reaction. His publisher in America is Charles Scribner. You perhaps have heard of the very eminent New York publisher. Published, among other things, at this time, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, okay? And they published Churchill. That's how I got started on my book, by the way. I was doing a visiting teaching gig at Princeton University. I realized the Scribner papers were there in Firestone Library. I thought, well, maybe they got some material on Churchill. They had quite a lot. Okay. And what it reveals is that every one of the books that Scribner published by Churchill was a flop, including his book on the First World War. And when you ask why, well, put it this way. Why did Americans not join the League of Nations? Okay. Why did they become disillusioned with the First World War? Okay, because they thought they had been snookered into the war by crafty British imperialists like Winston Churchill. And Churchill certainly wrote a defense of his conduct in the war as First Lord of the Admiralty, including the Gallipoli invasion, which he tried to present as something that would have succeeded if they'd only had given up so easily. And as far as Americans were concerned, this was hooey. Okay. They wanted no part of it. Okay. Churchill was not viewed in the heroic terms we view him today. He was just considered to be another wily British militarist and imperialist. And it's very difficult for me to convey to you how much anti-British sentiment there was in the United States back in the 1920s and 1930s. Churchill was a president for a while of the English-Speaking Union. You may know the organization, it's still around today. It was an organization designed to promote Anglo-American friendship. There were congressmen who were demanding that it be investigated as a subversive organization. This is where the Communist Party. They're trying to undermine American independence. Okay, paranoid, of course, but that illustrates the attitudes at the time. So Churchill is not able to sell himself to the Americans, and even among the British, his political fortunes are sinking because the kind of high rhetoric he used, which was popular before 1914, is out of fashion after the war. David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister during the First World War, was also a very flamboyant public speaker. And he had promised, he had some great phrases. He had promised to deal Germany, quote, a knockout blow. He had promised to, quote, squeeze Germany until the pips squeak, i.e. demand reparations from them. He had promised homes fit for heroes, i.e. the veterans who came home were going to have jobs, they're going to have proper housing, basically welfare state measures. None of that happened. Okay. And shortly after the war, he's out of power. His political career comes to an end. And a very new style of politics and political rhetoric comes into fashion. Very understated, very matter of fact. Politicians like Stanley Baldwin, a conservative, like Clement Attlee, who's in the Labour Party, like Neville Chamberlain, another conservative. And what do they have in common? They're not stirring public speakers. In fact, they're terrible. They are strictly stick to the facts. They don't embellish them. No dramatics. But of course, that's part of their appeal. They're not trying to bamboozle you with a lot of high-flown rhetoric. And they get things done. That's their slogan. Why did Neville Chamberlain become Prime Minister? Well, in part because in the 1920s he had served as Minister of Health, and he revamps Britain's system of health care. He invests a lot of very, very hard work in it. You know how detailed a health care plan can be. We've had certainly experience with that. You have to negotiate between doctors and hospitals and healthcare providers and insurers and so on to get them all on the same page. And if you don't do that, your website's going to crash and everybody's going to be in a mess. But Neville Chamberlain really planned it out, and the result was he was applauded by all political parties for this. Okay. And that's the image he was able to present. I'm a guy who gets people together around a table and works out a solution and gets it accomplished. And that's the kind of politician that people were looking for at that time. Churchill is viewed more and more as a hothead. And it was a very interesting letter that Chamberlain wrote at the time. When he was Minister of Health, Churchill was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s. And he said, Churchill is a brilliant artist. No question about it. He has a wonderful way with words. But he has no sense of practicality. What will happen in a cabinet meeting is that we'll be sort of brainstorming ideas. And Churchill will, an idea will roll into his head. It will develop and blossom in his mind. He'll become more and more agitated about it. He'll work up this flow of rhetoric about it. And he will then say, we have to do this. And the idea just occurred to him a few minutes before. And then I come in and ask him, how's it going to work? How are you going to pay for it? And he can't answer that. Because he has he's a literateur, he's not a practical politician. And of course, all political parties need people who are good with words, of course, but they also need people who can actually run the machinery of government, and that he has no capacity for. And so you can see how the two men, although they did work together for a time, would fall out with each other. Okay, Churchill in the 1930s is, of course, as we say, in the political wilderness. He's spending a lot of his time with a project he conceived of with Scribners. If some of you are familiar with Scribners, you may know the editor Maxwell Perkins. Some of you heard him? Okay. The most famous editor in the history of American literature. He worked with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe. And he didn't work that much with Churchill, but he did once meet him and give him an idea. Why don't you write a history of the British Empire? And Churchill said, I've got a better idea. It's good. Why don't I write a history of the English-speaking peoples? Sounded good to Scribner, okay. Why was Churchill writing this? Because his fondest dream was to create a permanent Anglo-American alliance. He's half American himself, after all. Okay. And he believes as long as the U.S. and Britain are allied, they can preserve the peace, they can preserve liberty throughout the world. If we'd only stuck together, if we'd only had an Anglo-American alliance in 1914, World War I would never have happened. And if we have an Anglo-American alliance now, we can stop Hitler. So, and how do we create that alliance? Through literature. We create a common history that brings together both Americans and Britons. And that's why he's writing this book. Well, he did eventually publish it, not until well after World War II. It's an interesting book. It is not exactly what a professional historian would call real history. There's more mythology than anything else. It certainly bears his personal stamp. But here's the problem. First of all, as I've said, Americans were not interested in an Anglo-American alliance before World War II. They were deeply, deeply distrustful of Great Britain. They felt that any alliance would be dragging American boys in to fight for the British Empire. And they were not about to do that. Britain had run up huge war debts from the First World War. And then in 1933, the British defaulted. Well, they had no choice. They were broke. It was a depression. But of course, the U.S. was broke too, and we needed that money. And as far as we were concerned, we'd been snookered by the British. And then the year 1934, Congress passes the Johnson Act, which basically states, if you defaulted on your war debts, we're not loaning you another penny. Bear that in mind when Neville Chamberlain is planning his appeasement policies afterward. I mean, the Americans have served notice on him. You get into another war, you're on your own. You can't count on this. And indeed, when Joe Kennedy, the father, of course, of JFK, was appointed ambassador to Great Britain, the first speech he gives there, normally they would say, of course, I'm here to promote the friendship of the English and American peoples. That's not what he said. He said, again, we're not backing Britain in another war. You're on your own. So what do you expect Chamberlain to do? But Churchill keeps holding out the hope that through his writing, he can bring the two countries together. And Chamberlain writes another a letter, and he says, look, does Churchill read what the Americans are saying about us in their newspapers? Well, I do. I read it, and they're talking about we're glad we have a real He-Man American standing up to those wily Brits. Well, what can we hope for from the Americans? The other problem was that, of course, in 1938, there's a big debate over the Munich conference, the concessions that Chamberlain made to Hitler, handing over the Sudetenland. And probably the way you've heard this history is that Churchill is heroically denouncing this policy in Parliament. Well, he did, but the problem is that what he would do is he would show up in the middle of a debate, he'd get the speaker's attention, he'd make a speech denouncing appeasement, then he'd get up and leave, which didn't make a very good impression on Parliament. There were other MPs who also opposed appeasement, who wanted Churchill to lead him, but he's not there. Where is he? He's writing his book. Writing takes a lot of time, and it meant he was not there a great deal on the floor of the House of Commons leading the anti-appeasement forces. And largely for that reason, Chamberlain didn't have to worry about Churchill's opposition because it was rather disorganized, and not terribly effective. But of course, when the Second World War finally broke out, Churchill was vindicated. But that was only after there had been a real effort to actually suppress Churchill's writings on the Nazi Germany. There's not much known, but Neville Chamberlain was very, very good at manipulating the British press, the British media. He practiced what is sometimes called access journalism, as opposed to investigative journalism. Access journalism means you give selected journalists special access to insiders like yourself. Chamberlain would organize have weekly press briefings, and friendly journalists were invited, and he would basically brief them on his policies, and they would then publish pretty much what Chamberlain had said. But of course, they're putting his spin on everything. They're not analyzing it critically. They're not doing legwork. They're not exposing the problems involved in it. And of course, if you do deviate from the government's line, you don't get invited back to these press briefings. And it was a very, very effective tool. And Chamberlain did talk to the big newspaper proprietors in Britain. There were only about a dozen of them. They owned all the newspapers. And basically told them, look, don't give Churchill any coverage. Don't give him any oxygen. And yes, to a large extent, Churchill could not get a hearing in the British press. Once one of his supporters asked him, look, why don't you go out and make a series of speeches around the country trying to rouse the people to the threat of Hitler? And Churchill said there'd be no point to it. The only point to giving a speech is if it's covered in the media, and it's not going to be covered. I'd be speaking to a vacuum, which is largely true. Now, one way around this, there was a literary agent, a Hungarian Jew named Emery Reeves, who got out of Germany just in time after Hitler took power, and he worked out a very, very lucrative business. He would ask famous world leaders to write newspaper columns and syndicate them. And he approaches Churchill about that, and Churchill agrees. And the result is that Churchill's columns are syndicated in the 1930s all throughout Europe. Of course, not in Nazi Germany, but in all the other neutral countries. And again, he is rousing, he's having quite an influence. The Nazis notice this, and they start putting pressure on the neutral countries to stop publishing Churchill's columns. If you do this, we're cutting off trade with you. If you do this, German companies are not going to advertise in your papers. And the implicit threat, if you keep doing this, we're going to invade you. So even before these countries are actually invaded by Germany, they are shutting down Churchill's columns, one by one. But you see how powerful his writing was, how influential it was, and that's because it was so dangerous. Both Chamberlain and, of course, Hitler want to suppress it, and they to a large extent, they succeeded. Well, of course, once it is clear that Hitler is not going to abide by the terms of the Munich Agreement, Churchill's political stock rises. He's able to get a hearing, and ultimately, of course, when the war breaks out, Chamberlain is forced to bring him into the government as First Lord of the Admiralty. And he's still, even in the government, when he should be running the British Navy, he's writing his book, History of the English-Speaking Peoples, spending hours on it. He doesn't finish it in time for the war, so it doesn't really affect the war, the American alliance very much. Okay, the May of 1940, Hitler breaks through into Denmark, into Norway. The invasion of Norway is the British try to parry it. Their counter-invasion is a fiasco. And members of Parliament are demanding accountability. Now, who was in charge of the invasion of Norway? Churchill. He's First Lord of the Admiralty. It was a primarily naval operation. It looks like another Gallipoli, another naval operation that Churchill has bungled. But this time, of course, he doesn't take the blame for it. The blame falls upon Chamberlain. Why not? Because through his denunciations of Hitler, Churchill had kind of created in the minds of the British people a melodramatic play. Hitler's the villain, Churchill's the hero. They're engaged in an epic struggle between good and evil. Certainly Hitler is always denouncing Churchill on the radio. He's his arch enemy. And that simply raises Churchill's prestige in the eyes of the British public. So ultimately it's Chamberlain who has to resign as Prime Minister and Churchill who takes over. And none of the opprobrium connected with the Norwegian operation rubs off on Churchill. Now, of course, it is at this point that Germany then launches an invasion of France and the Low Countries, practically on the day that Churchill takes office, which means he has to deal with a crisis from the very start. Now, much has been written about the great speeches that Churchill gave in May and June of 1940, those days of crisis, as German forces overran the Low Countries, cornered British forces at Dunkirk, and then conquered all of France. And it's said that Churchill's speeches kept British morale up. Well, they did, but I want you to qualify that. The Ministry of Information in Britain took weekly, or in some cases almost daily, soundings of British morale during the Second World War. They looked at opinion polls, they looked at surveys, they looked at conversations that were overheard in pubs to try to get a sense of what the morale of the British people was. And what is now apparent is that as Hitler was overrunning France, that morale was very shaky, shakier than we've generally been led to believe. How could it not be? I mean, Hitler was simply winning every battle. Okay? And yes, when Churchill gave his speeches, we shall fight on the beaches, fight on the landing fields, so on, we will never surrender. Yes, it would boost morale temporarily, but then after a few days the effect would wear off and morale would start to sink again. So great speeches, in other words, were important, but they were not enough by themselves. And morale really hit rock bottom when, in the middle of June 1940, France surrenders. Yeah, that never happened in the First World War. The French had fought for 4 years. They'd taken terrible losses, but there was never any thought of surrender. Georges Clemenceau, the French premier during World War I, once said in the French National Assembly, "You ask what my policy is? Je fais la guerre. I wage war. What is my foreign policy? Je fais la guerre. My domestic policy? Je fais la guerre. My economic policy? Je fais la guerre." And he also said, "I will fight on the Marne. I will fight on the Seine. I will fight in front of Paris. I will fight in Paris. I will fight behind Paris. I will fight on the Loire. I will fight on the Pyrenees. And if we are pushed off the Pyrenees, we will fight on the seas. But surrender, never." Does that sound familiar to you? Churchill heard that speech. It doesn't mean that Churchill was a plagiarist. When he made that speech, France was on the verge of surrendering. And what he's basically, the speech is aimed at the French. He's reminding them of what Clemenceau said. It's a literary illusion, if you put it that way. Yeah, he's telling them, come on, we need that kind of spirit today. Well, it didn't work this time. French morale did collapse. And British morale, after France surrenders, if France surrenders, how can they possibly win the war on their own? It was a question many people were asking. The question also arises, what's going to happen to the French fleet? The French had a fairly good navy. It was still intact. Would it fall into the hands of the Germans? There was a big French naval squadron at Oran in Algeria. That was a French colony. And the British commander sailed over there and basically gave the French commander an ultimatum. You can go over to the British side. We can escort you to a neutral port. You can disarm your vessels, but if you don't do that, we'll destroy your fleet. Maybe if they had given the French admiral more time to think about it, they could have resolved it peacefully. But Churchill gives the order, no, destroy the French fleet. This was unprecedented in British history. They had never before fired upon an ally. Now, where did he get this idea? Well, again, it's from melodrama. Go back to that. Melodramatic plays in the Victorian period always had a device. It's called the coup de théâtre. And what this is it is a sudden plot twist, a radical turn of events. Those who are on top are suddenly vulnerable. Those who are at the bottom suddenly are on top. You don't expect it. It comes from nowhere. It should leave the audience gasping. And Churchill knew how effective that was in mesmerizing an audience. He now faces a situation where British morale is crumbling. France is gone. Hitler is convinced the war is over. He's won. Churchill has to do something that everyone's going to sit up and take notice for. What does he do? He does, what is the most incredible thing? Destroys the French fleet. It was utterly ruthless. It killed 1,250 French sailors. But it scored for Britain, and you might say for France as well, a huge psychological victory because it sent the message, Britain is in the fight to stay, and we will stop at nothing to defeat Hitler. It impressed Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt at first didn't trust Churchill. I know we're depicted as being great friends, but he didn't know Churchill very well at this point. Churchill was appealing for American aid, and Roosevelt at this point was not going to give him any, because who knew? What if he gives Churchill weapons, and then Churchill turns around and surrenders, or makes a deal with Hitler? And those weapons could have been used to build up America's own defenses, which were totally inadequate at that time. Remember, Americans still don't think very highly of Britain. So at this point, Roosevelt is keeping Churchill very much at arm's length. Okay? But once the fleet at Oran is destroyed, suddenly Roosevelt wakes up and says, wait a minute. Churchill's obviously serious about this. Then he begins thinking differently about aiding Britain, and that eventually, of course, leads to Lend-Lease, which wrote, but that involved a change of heart on Roosevelt's part. Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain, he just won the Spanish Civil War with the help of Hitler and Mussolini. Everyone expects him to come into the war on Hitler's side, but Oran is right across the Mediterranean from Spain, and when he sees the British fleet destroy the French fleet, he has second thoughts about that and starts backing off, and in fact never joins the war on Hitler's side. Okay. Hitler himself suddenly has second thoughts. He is due to give a speech to the Reichstag right after, he postpones it twice, 3 times, because he's not sure what to do next. He assumed Britain was going to surrender. And this doesn't happen. Okay. My point is that Churchill, because of this sense of the dramatic, drama is very important in war, was able to turn around British morale. And by the way, again, those measurements of British morale went through the roof after the French fleet is destroyed and never come down again. It had exactly the psychological effect that Churchill had hoped for. Okay. And throughout the war, Churchill is going to be giving rousing speeches, quoting poetry, quoting Kipling, quoting Lord Byron, quoting Tennyson. His speeches become something very entertaining and uplifting to listen to. He has a wonderful ear for the English language, but he also, very oddly, embraces a form of the English language which you probably wouldn't expect him to embrace. And it's this. A linguist at Cambridge University named C.K. Ogden had developed what he called basic English. Now, the idea was he wanted to develop a simplified version of English that could be taught to foreigners easily. So he reduced the whole vocabulary of the English language to 850 words, which you can easily learn. And then every other more complicated concepts could be made by simply sort of fitting these words together in compound words. And basically designed it as an ESL tool. In other words, if you want to learn English as a second language, you can pick this up very easily. And Churchill takes the idea and says, this is terrific. This way we can spread the English language to all parts of the world. He gives a speech to Harvard University, saying that the empires of the future will be the empires of the mind. He persuades Franklin Roosevelt to look into it. He persuades the British cabinet to look into it. He overlooks the fact there are certain obvious problems with his approach to language. First of all, how could Churchill deliver his own speeches in 850 words? Franklin Roosevelt said it's a good idea, but how would blood, face water, and eye water sound? Absurd. It takes all the color out of the English language. Why is English such a vivid and because we have so many words and such a huge vocabulary. We've had all kinds of nuances. Now those nuances are all gone completely. Moreover, it would become impossible to express really complicated concepts in it because the language is simply oversimplified. And of course, it does involve linguistic imperialism. We're going to spread English to all these other non-English speaking areas. Well, how are the Spanish, how's Latin America going to react to it, and so on. It was obviously, they reacted very hostily to it. And one writer, rather famous writer in the Second World War, takes this idea and writes a brilliant satire of it. And the writer's name, of course, is George Orwell. And he turns basic English into Newspeak. And what is Newspeak? Newspeak narrows human thought by eliminating words. If you have a language where there is no word for democracy, there is no word for liberty, then there's no way you can conceive of democracy. or liberty, and of course, can be used by a totalitarian society to narrow the range of human thought. And basic English never survived that satire. And it wasn't such a bad system, again, if you wanted to learn English as a second language, but it was damned forever by its association with George Orwell, even though Churchill himself was very much in favor of it. I said that Churchill could have been a great playwright, and to illustrate that, I'm going to take a very famous episode from his book, The Second World War. It's one of the most memorable sequences in the book. It's October 1944. The Red Army has pushed the Germans out of Russia. They're about to advance into the Balkans. The British, of course, also have interests in the Balkans. Churchill flies to Moscow to confer with Stalin, just the two of them. He doesn't tell Franklin Roosevelt about this. And there's a famous scene in which he and Stalin meet at the Kremlin, and Churchill says, we're about to move into the Balkans. Let's not come at cross purposes to each other. Let's not conflict with each other. Let's work out a deal. And Churchill presents to Stalin a little typewritten sheet in which he has divided up all the countries in the Balkans on a percentage basis. We, the British, will get 90% of Greece, you get 10%. You get 90% of Romania, we get 10%. You get 75% of Bulgaria, we get 25%. Yugoslavia will split 50-50. Stalin says nothing, and then he pushes the paper over to Stalin. Stalin says nothing. Picks up the paper. Takes a couple of puffs on his pipe. Takes a big blue pencil. Makes a big check mark on it. Passes it back to Churchill. We're all looking guiltily at that paper. And then finally Churchill breaks the silence and said, look, it's going to look bad in the history books if we decide the fate of millions of people with this kind of agreement. Why don't we burn the paper? And then Stalin says, no, you keep it. Now, as diplomacy, this was totally amateurish. Made no sense whatsoever. If you've got a British occupation officer and a Russian occupation officer in Bulgaria and they come to loggerheads, what does having 25% or 75% of Bulgaria mean? How's it going to resolve itself? No. You have to, if you're going to work out an occupation agreement, you're going to have to be far more detailed than that. You're going to have to work out exactly which zones each country controls, as they did in Germany, of course. And usually, when countries sign diplomatic agreements, they sign them in ink and they keep copies, for future reference. What was Churchill even thinking about this? The British Foreign Office was apoplectic. Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, didn't know what the hell Churchill was up to. As diplomacy, it's amateurish, but as theater, it's absolutely brilliant. This reads like a well-constructed West End play. I mean, think of it. You've got a scene in which Churchill does almost all this talking. He weaves his web of words. He pushes the paper over to Stalin. Okay. And then what Churchill does is creates a trap of his own making, and all Stalin has to do is flick the switch. And Churchill has all the lines except for the final, the mordant curtain line. No, you keep it. Curtain. If you were designing a play about a diplomatic melodrama and you're discussing a treaty negotiation, no player would go through all the boring details of the treaty. You provide a kind of a shorthand that the audience could easily grasp, and that's what Churchill was doing. Except it's not a play; it's reality. He often couldn't quite distinguish between drama and real life. Okay. There's one other episode at the end of the war which is going to reflect Churchill's literary interests. After the surrender of Germany, Britain had a coalition government during the war. Churchill, with the Conservative Party, was prime minister. Clement Attlee, the head of the Labour Party, was deputy prime minister. And after Germany surrenders, Attlee says, well, we don't need the coalition anymore. We haven't had an election in Britain for 10 years. Now's the time to hold an election. And there's no, of course, paid broadcast advertising in Britain, but the BBC does give free airtime to all of the candidates. So Churchill gives a radio speech in which he says, you know, directing this at the Labour Party, "I tell you from the bottom of my heart, you cannot bring socialism to Britain without also bringing in some kind of Gestapo." Now, you have to understand that, yes, Clement Attlee was a socialist, but a very, very moderate one. He was very, very mild-mannered and soft-spoken. He was not the orator that Churchill was. He sounded like an insurance salesman. Okay. No one could have been more unlike Hitler than Clement Attlee. It was a ludicrous charge. And Attlee then comes on, in his turn, he comes on his broadcast, and he says that was not Churchill, the war leader, talking. That was Churchill, the partisan politician, talking. And of course, Attlee makes a far, far better impression upon the electorate. That may have contributed to his victory over Churchill in the election. So where did Churchill get this idea that, you know, a Labour Party victory would lead to a Gestapo? Well, F.A. Hayek, you know, the libertarian economist, had just published his book, The Road to Serfdom, in which he argued, you know, if the government creates a welfare state and gives you all kinds of stuff, they can also take away your freedom. And that can be very dangerous in the long run. We do know that he sent copies of the book to Churchill. What we don't know is whether Churchill actually read it. He never actually referred to it specifically. I personally think it was not Hayek who influenced Churchill on this count. It was another author you may have heard of, Sinclair Lewis, who had earlier written a book called It Can't Happen Here. And it was a kind of dystopian novel, something like 1984, imagining a fascist dictatorship in the United States. And the villain in this case is the dictator is very obviously modeled on Huey Long. And we know Churchill did read that novel, was very impressed by it. And when Long was assassinated, Churchill gloated over it. You know, he's the most clownish dictator tribe. I'm glad he was killed. Because Churchill said, yes, here is Huey Long promising every man a king, giving goodies to everybody, but he's just using it as a ruse so that he can impose a dictatorship on the United States. Well, in the case of Huey Long, this was quite a legitimate fear. Clement Attlee is also talking about redistributing wealth, but obviously in a much more sensible and sane manner, and Churchill couldn't distinguish between the two. As far as he was concerned, he projected his feelings about Huey Long onto Clement Attlee, which is, of course, totally misguided. The other factor, however, is that this may have been a legitimate fear of Churchill. What we now call the national security state, of course we're very much concerned about that now at the NSA and all, really took root, began to grow in the Second World War. The agency's MI5 expanded enormously under Churchill's watch. And he knew better than anyone else the potential for infringing civil liberties and infringing privacy that this entailed. In one sense, he was raising a very legitimate issue. Yes, in wartime we have to expand the powers of the intelligence services. Yes, we may have to restrict civil liberties somewhat. Is this going to become permanent, though, or simply a wartime expedient? And basically he was arguing, no, we can't allow this to go on in peacetime. But he did not remain in power to actually carry that out. Anyway, that may give you some sense of how literature shaped Churchill's conduct of the war, and I'm open to questions.
Congratulations on being a very expert wordsmith. However, I noticed in your discussion of the 1930s Prime Minister's poem, etc., you never mentioned the word appeasement.
Yeah. Well, I did, at least I did touch upon it.
Which is basically what Churchill was fighting against.
Yes. Yes, he was. Now, appeasement was for a long time a popular policy. Chamberlain, through, as I said, his influence with the press, was able to sell it to the British people, at least for a while, until the policy obviously no longer worked. And interestingly, in his history of the Second World War, Churchill included a passage in which he said, "I'm not saying that appeasement never works. In the majority of cases, it does work. In the majority of cases, you can sometimes defuse international confrontations by making compromises, by making concessions." It's just that if you are dealing with a power or a dictator who is clearly not going to be satisfied by any concessions, then you're only encouraging him. But he did not condemn appeasement under all circumstances. And bear in mind, he's writing that book later during the Cold War, and during the Cold War, Churchill is an advocate of what he called a parley at the summit. He invents the concept of summit conference. He wants to talk with the Russians specifically about limiting nuclear arms. And then some people will argue that appeasing them. And I think he's saying, well, no, that's not appeasement, because I think we can reach a deal with the Russians which we cannot reach with Hitler.
When we get to Chamberlain, I've always thought that there was that concept, that utterance of, don't worry, peace in our time.
Yeah.
Was that a true statement that was set up?
Well, okay. First of
all,
all, I think it was first said by Benjamin Disraeli.
Disraeli,
Peace
right.
with honor.
Peace with his honor, he actually said, when he, in fact, but you see, Disraeli said it when he had confronted Russians over their advances in the Balkans. It actually forced them to back down. Okay, so he had avoided a war and yet preserved Britain's preeminence in that area. The idea that Chamberlain should use the phrase was actually first suggested by his aides when they were flying back from Munich. And at first Chamberlain said, no, it's too hokey. What if this doesn't work? I really want to avoid it. But they kept pushing him. And finally, he did say, I believe it is peace in our time, which is a somewhat more qualified statement than it is often portrayed to be. Yes.
Churchill has so many wonderful quotes. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, gosh. Of course, a lot of them are apocryphal. There are a lot of quotes he attributed to him that he never actually said. I wish I could.
Well, I saw one in the Churchill War Rooms, which
Yeah.
you mentioned that he wasn't very religious, or
No, he was not.
well, it said I plan to spend my first million years in heaven painting.
I think he meant that as something of a joke. But he also put that actually this was his theology, the way he worked it out. He said, "Look, believe whatever you want to believe." Yes, when I was a young man, I was brought up as a conventional Anglican member of Church of England, believed it all. Then, like many young people, I said it was all bull. I rejected it. I became militantly irreligious. And then I found, when I was under fire in these colonial wars, despite my atheism, I didn't hesitate to pray for survival. So I arrived at this theology and basically said, yeah, believe what you want when you want to believe it. Don't worry about whether science and religion are reconcilable. Why would you want to reconcile them? The point is, if religion makes you happy, if it makes you content with life, it gives it meaning, go ahead. Who's going to be harmed by that? Whether it's consistent or not, it makes no difference. So I think that was his he basically, you could say it's a kind of opportunistic theology, but, and certainly in some of his speeches he invokes God. But, that's because it's a convenient metaphor. Yeah, sure.
So did Hitler.
Well, yes, he did, but I think Hitler was,
His perception of God. Hitler's perception.
he certainly rejected Christianity. He did rather admire Islam. He thought that was a warrior religion. Yeah. And he often once said, it was too bad that the Europeans didn't adopt Islam. I think that he wanted to basically substitute a kind of a Nordic mythology for Christianity. Yeah.
Was Britain really in need of a Clement Attlee after the war, a more of a pragmatic rather than a playwright, rather than a poet like Churchill?
Well, the British voters thought so. No, and I may admit, as I said, we basically, depending on the national mood, the British vacillated between the great rhetoricians and the very down-to-earth speaking. In 1940, they wanted someone with high rhetoric, and that's what Churchill was, essential. But 1945, the war, they've been through 6 years of war. They've been through 6 years of Churchill's over-the-top rhetoric. They're tired of it. And what Attlee is promising is a welfare state. Yes, as I said, Attlee spoke like an insurance salesman, but that's what he said in his election addresses. If you're unemployed, you're covered. If you're injured, you're covered. If you're sick, you're covered. If you're disabled, you're covered. That's what people wanted to hear at that point. And so, yes, that's why he won by a landslide. Yeah.
How do you fit in Churchill's colonial ideas, into the whole story that you're giving about?
Oh, it's very simple. And that is, one species of Victorian melodrama was the imperial melodrama. We always set in the colonies. The hero inevitably was a British officer defending the natives. Now, most of the natives were good natives because they respected the British. They wanted to be ruled by them. They're not really capable of governing themselves. They're like children. We have to protect them. And that was very much Churchill's attitude, very paternalistic. But there are a few of maybe these wicked natives who rebel against British rule, and we have to put them down. And some of them are even worse. They are treacherous natives. They pretend to be friends of Britain, but really they're out to stab us in the back. And these were conventions of the Victorian stage. Now, when he faces Mahatma Gandhi, he reacts exactly that way, according to it. Now, there are many British politicians like Stanley Baldwin who basically said, look, we've got to make concessions to the Indians. We've got to give them more self-government. It's the 20th century. That we have to be realistic. But Churchill utterly refuses. He's still stuck in the 19th century. And when Gandhi resorts to his nonviolent campaign, resistance, and does seem to be willing to work with the British as long as they do give the Indians independence, Churchill doesn't interpret that as a gesture of goodwill. He interprets that as treachery. Gandhi pretends to be our friend, but he is in fact working hand in glove with the Japanese, with the fascists, whatever. And he puts Gandhi in jail. And he really, he insists on viewing 20th century India through the prism of bad 19th century plays. And he's really rather pig-headed about that. Yeah.
How accurate was Churchill as a historian?
Okay. He didn't call his book on the Second World War a history. He was very clear about that. It's a narrative, he said, it's a story. It is not a complete history. I leave that to the historians to write. What it is basically, like his earliest books, a piece of war reportage. I was there, I observed what went on, these are my impressions of it, as opposed to being a complete balanced history of the war. It's not unbiased. Okay. I'm at the center of the story, of course, very Winston-centric, but I am providing some of the raw material that later historians can use to write a more complete history. So is it incomplete? Sure. Is it biased? Yes. Is it accurate? More or less. But Churchill never pretended otherwise.
And he had multiple corrections as each edition came out.
Well, he not only had corrections, he had a whole team of researchers. Only about half of that book is written by him. The rest he farmed out to researchers who would write up chapters, and he would, of course, approve them and make corrections and so on. But a lot of it is ghostwritten, frankly. Yeah.
During the World War, a lot of Hitler's top people, Goebbels, were very much inveigled in Tibetan and Bhutanese religion.
Oh, really? Okay.
We never knew about that, but recent stuff has brought that forward in real contrast to what was going on. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there's a very good book by Timothy Ryback called Hitler's Private Library. They actually did recover his own library. He had a huge personal library. He spent lots of hours reading by himself. And this does give you some insight into Hitler's mindset. There's a lot of occult religion, yes. There's a lot of very weird, of course, racial literature, and so yes, I think that fits into that whole pattern. In his own way, you could say that Hitler was also something of an artist, something of a literary person, in the sense that, well, he was literally an artist. He was like Churchill. He was a painter. And what he really aimed at was to create Germany in his own warped artistic vision. One of his plans was, after the war, he was going to tear down all of downtown Berlin and build these gigantic hypertrophy, classical, neoclassical public buildings. And he was going to do that also in 50 other German cities. The aim of the war, therefore, was to make all this possible. They're going to be built by slave labor, basically. If you've ever seen the Leni Riefenstahl's documentary, Triumph of the Will, Hitler should receive equal billing with that. Riefenstahl was the director, but Hitler was the lead actor. He wrote his own speeches. He designed the sets. He was a choreographer. He arranged for all those stormtroopers to march in unison. He designed the props, the banners. Okay, and he and Leni Riefenstahl worked beautifully together. They understood each other because they had both the same artistic vision.
What was the name of that?
A Triumph of the Will. Yes.
Any truth to the story that World War I,
Yes.
while Churchill, I think he was at the Admiralty, is that right?
Yeah. First Lord of the Admiralty, at least
Yeah.
for the first half of the war. Yes.
At the sinking of the Lusitania, that the British had broken the German code. They knew that German submarine was there, but they did not alert the Lusitania because they wanted to draw America into the war by getting us anti-German.
We had a discussion about this over at dinner. Put it this way, it is true that Churchill at one point said if the Germans would only sink an American ship, it might bring the U.S. into the war. Did he actually plot to do that? I don't believe so. The Germans had announced that Britain was basically under a submarine blockade. They had ads placed in New York newspapers. They'd warned travelers, if you travel through this zone, the ship could be sunk by a German submarine. So the Lusitania knew that there was a risk. The captain knew there was a risk of that, whatever route they took to get to Britain. What route? It would have happened sooner or later, if not the Lusitania, to some other ship, I think. And of course, the Lusitania was carrying war material secretly, which made it a legitimate target under the rules of war. A civilian ship should not be carrying that sort of stuff. So I don't quite believe the conspiracy theories surrounding that sort of thing. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I read something not that long ago where there were this fight going on in Yugoslavia between Mihailovic and Tito.
Yeah.
Tito was a communist and Mihailovic wasn't. Mihailovic was helping us.
Yeah.
And Tito wasn't. And the British got behind Tito.
Mm-hmm.
And the real reason was there was a Soviet mole.
Mm-hmm.
And the Soviet mole convinced intelligence to go after him. And the people that were involved and understood what Mihailovic was doing was very upset. But Churchill said it was one of the biggest mistakes he ever made.
Yes.
Because it was declassified years later. Nobody knew this.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was interesting. So sometimes I think he tended to spin things in ways that weren't helpful.
Yeah. He was at the time convinced that Tito was doing a better job of killing Germans, and that was he'd fallen victim to Tito's own PR.
Right.
Basically. Yeah.
That's why Yugoslavia became communist, and that's why it's gone.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah, but that was certainly a miscalculation on his part.
Well, at that time, didn't Zagreb, Croatia, didn't they become Nazi?
Well,
I mean, they were so right-wing compared to Tito's liberalism and communism. But I'll tell you, as a medical person, Tito didn't trust his own surgeons. We used to send people back to the 97th General Hospital, pick them up and load and bring them back and bring them back.
There was a four-way civil war going on in Yugoslavia during the Second World War. There were Tito's partisans who were communists. There were Mihailovic's Chetniks who were royalists but still a resistance fighter. There was a collaborationist regime that the Germans set up in what remained of Serbia under an old Serbian general, sort of like, Petain served in France, and they were fighting on the German side. And then there was a fascist state of Croatia under the Ustashi, which was terroristic fascist group and extremely brutal, and they're all fighting each other more than they're fighting the Germans to some extent. So Yugoslavia it's not really a country. It is several hostile nationalities that were pushed together, and it never really worked very well. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about the sources of his style? You mentioned 3 playwrights, but
yes,
several of them were sort of later in his life. What were the early?
Well, actually, I think Wilde was very early in his life. Wilde was a very good friend of his mother. He wrote an essay called "The Scaffolding of Rhetoric" as a young man, and he never published it, but it's basically a guide to rhetoric. And what he argues is that there's no such thing as acting naturally. We're all playing roles all the time. And the question is, how well do we play those roles? And a politician, we say he's putting on an act. A politician believes what he says when he says it. He really gets into his role. And certainly that was true of Churchill, because once he fell in love with certain phrases, he adopted them and carried them out with a passion. Oscar Wilde wrote an essay a few years earlier called "The Decay of Lying," which made basically the same points. And I argue that Churchill's essay is very much based upon Wilde's essay. So that was certainly an early influence.
With poetry? You haven't mentioned poetry.
Poetry,
He knew a lot of scads of Shakespeare.
Somewhat Shakespeare. I think more Tennyson. Lord Byron was perhaps more of an influence. Amongst prose writers, Edward Gibbon, and he had read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. William Babington Macaulay, who of course was also a historian. But I think if you look at the essayists, you don't capture the real drama in Churchill's writing, and that came from the playwrights. Yeah.
I've always been thinking about the role of Chamberlain.
Yes.
And I'm wondering whether he really didn't deserve the vilification that he got.
Okay.
And my reasoning is, England really in 1938 was in a very vulnerable position. They were nearly bankrupt. By about 1940, their gold supply was practically nil. And, I think Chamberlain was a realist. And I always thought, well, everybody vilifies Chamberlain, like he's a tragic figure in literature, And I think the tragedy is after World War I, when Germany was basically disarmed and they were allowed, somehow or other, they armed themselves without any involvement by the Western powers to stop it right then and there. I mean, and one of the reasons may be the way the League of Nations failed. And America was not part of the League of Nations.
Okay.
So I think the door was open for Hitler, and he just went and did what he wanted to do, and no one said, hey, we have a treaty here. He didn't care about a treaty, Hitler.
Okay.
So why was that? That's history now. We know that what happened.
Okay, a few things. The Versailles Treaty did disarm Germany, but it also said Germany would be disarmed as a prelude to general disarmament, i.e. first Germany disarms, then the rest of us disarm. Well, the second part of that treaty was not carried out. The British still had a powerful navy, the French still had a very large army, and this gives Hitler an argument. You know, we carried out our part of the deal, and you know, the Allies are not carrying out theirs. So that put the Allies in morally a weak position. Was Britain prepared to go to war, ready to go to war in September of 1938, the Munich crisis? No, Britain was not ready to go to war. Neither was Germany. Britain's air defenses were almost non-existent, but Germany would not have been capable at that point of conducting a sustained air war against Britain. And Hitler's generals knew how badly prepared, how ill-prepared they were, and they were pleading with him not to go to war over Czechoslovakia. And many of his own advisors, like Goering, were pleading with him not to go to war. Basically, almost all of them were. So that when Chamberlain offers Hitler a deal, a compromise which nevertheless gives Hitler half of what he wants, all of Hitler's advisors say, take it, for God's sake. And rather reluctantly, he gives in, because he really wanted the war at that point, even though he was not ready to fight it. Now, I see Chamberlain's logic, I think, basically was wrong, and for a number of reasons. First of all, had Chamberlain stood up to Hitler and said, yeah, you're not getting anything, one of three things would have happened. Hitler could have backed down, which he had done before. He might have tried to go to war, but his generals might have gotten rid of him. They were threatening to do that, secretly. Let's suppose he actually went to war. Germany would have been completely blockaded. They would not have had access to the resources of Eastern Europe. The Soviets might not have gone to war with Germany, but they certainly wouldn't have given them the resources they did give them later under the Nazi-Soviet pact. So very quickly, Germany would just run out of the materials necessary to fight a war. And the war would have been localized, it wouldn't have spread all over Europe, and ultimately they would have collapsed, probably in relatively short order. There were German officers on the Western Front, facing the French at the time of the Munich crisis, who told Hitler to his face, you can't go to war now because we have virtually no troops here on Germany's western border. The French are going to walk right through us if they chose to do it. Here there was a very high-stakes gambler, took a huge risk. In this case, the risks paid off, as it often did. Chamberlain should have pursued an alliance with the Soviet Union, which he did not, and Churchill was urging him to do that. So I think there were other options available to Chamberlain. Yeah. Now, on the plus side, in 1940, I mean, Britain has its radar network, it has the Spitfires, and everybody's praising Churchill, and Chamberlain writes in one of his last letters, hey, wait a minute, who built those Spitfires? On whose watch? Who started the construction of the radar network? I did. You can't just design a new fighter and roll it off the assembly line tomorrow. It takes years of research and development and production and training the pilots and so on. And that started under my watch, and that was my strategy. I wanted to simply buy time until Britain was ready to either contain Hitler or fight him if it came to war. I think that was not entirely right, because I think they could have stood up to Hitler in 1938. When Hitler gets to Sudetenland, he gets the Skoda Works, which is Czechoslovakia's big arms munitions plant, which enormously increases his capacity to produce weapons. So yes, Britain had more time to rearm, but then so did Hitler. Yeah.
All right. On behalf of the World War II Book Club, I'd like to thank you. And I'd also like to draw your attention, if you look on the wall, there's a memorial or a tribute to the founder, Dr. John McLaughlin. So please take a note and take a look at that. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, yes.
Enjoy.